Have you ever wondered what really happened to Lot's wife? The woman who became a pillar of salt for simply looking back at her burning city. For centuries, we've been told she was punished for disobedience, turned into a monument of warning for all who would dare defy God's command. What do you think really happened to Lot's wife? Was she truly disobedient? Nestled in what we now know as the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, this wasn't just any ordinary city. Archaeological evidence suggests it was prosperous. They didn't just visit Sodom, they made it their home. She has no name in the biblical text, no background, no voice. She appears only in the moment of her transformation. Yet Jewish traditions tell a very different story. Some sources call her Adu, others name her Edith. According to these ancient sources, she went from house to house in the neighborhood, telling the men of Sodom that strangers had come and that she needed salt for them. She was deliberately exposing the angels to danger, alerting the very people who would soon surround Lot's house with violent intentions. Do not look behind you and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains or you will be swept away. The specificity of these instructions is remarkable. Don't look back. Don't stop in the valley. Keep moving toward the mountains. These weren't casual suggestions, they were life or death commands. These aren't just random names invented by later storytellers. She was an active participant in the corruption of Sodom. The men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house demanding that he turn over his guests. The situation was so desperate that Lot offered his own daughters instead. Why was looking back so dangerous? Fire and brimstone rained down from the sky, consuming everything in their path. The ground shook, the air filled with smoke and ash, and the cities that had stood for generations were obliterated in a matter of moments. Modern geological evidence suggests this wasn't just a supernatural event. It was connected to a massive earthquake that struck the region around 2050 BCE, one of the most powerful earthquakes in the entire recorded history of the Dead Sea area. The Hebrew text gives us a clue. The word used for Lot's wife, looking back, is different from the word used when Abraham observes the destruction from a distance. Her looking was intense, prolonged, full of longing. It wasn't a casual glance over her shoulder. It was a deep, emotional gaze that revealed where her heart truly belonged, revealing just how far the moral decay had spread, affecting even the righteous. Someone who had so thoroughly embraced the city's values that she was willing to betray heavenly messengers to protect her way of life. They come from ancient traditions that may preserve memories the biblical writers chose not to include. The Bible tells us that Lot was sitting at the gate of the city when the angels arrived, and this detail is crucial. The city gate wasn't just an entrance, it was the center of legal and financial transactions. Lot held a position of importance, possibly as a judge or elder. This wasn't a temporary stay. This was a family that had put down deep roots in Sodom, sitting on major trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to Egypt. The streets buzzed with commerce. She was actively involved in the events that led to that fateful night. When the angels arrived at Lot's house, she didn't welcome them. Instead, she divided their house into two parts and told her husband, "If you want to receive them, do so in your part." When Lot asked her to bring salt for the guests, she responded, "Do you even wish to learn this bad habit from Abraham?" The markets overflowed with goods from distant lands, and the people lived in comfort that many other cities could only dream of. Or was there something more to her story? Drop a Y in the comments if you're ready to uncover the truth. And make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this investigation is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the Bible's most mysterious figures. But what if everything you've been taught about her fate is only part of the story? What if there's a deeper, more shocking truth hidden beneath the surface of this ancient tale? The story of Lot's wife appears in just one verse in the Bible, one single verse. Genesis 19:26 tells us she looked back and became a pillar of salt, and that's it. But here's what's fascinating. This brief account has captivated theologians, archaeologists, and storytellers for thousands of years. Why? because something doesn't add up. The silence surrounding her fate is deafening, and that silence might be hiding secrets that could completely change how we understand this biblical mystery. Today, we're going to dig deeper than anyone has before. We're going to explore ancient texts that most people have never heard of, examine archaeological evidence that's been largely overlooked, and uncover Jewish traditions that paint a completely different picture of what really happened that night in Sodom. We'll discover why she might have looked back, what her name actually was according to some sources, and most shocking of all, we'll reveal geological evidence that suggests her transformation might have been based on an actual catastrophic event that ancient people witnessed with their own eyes. But before we dive into this mystery, I want to hear from you. Let's begin our journey into the untold fate of Lot's wife, starting with the night that changed everything. Picture this: the ancient city of Sodom, around 2000 BCE. Into this bustling metropolis came Lot, Abraham's nephew, with his family. But here's where the story gets interesting. While we know Lot's position in the city, the Bible remains strangely silent about his wife. According to the Midrash, Lot's wife wasn't just a passive figure in this story. But here's the shocking part: she didn't just refuse to help. If this tradition is accurate, then Lot's wife wasn't an innocent victim of divine wrath. The night of destruction began with what the Bible describes as an exciting evening. This is actually a massive understatement. The angel struck the men of Sodom with blindness and urgently warned Lot's family, "Escape for your life." But why such specific instructions? As the family fled, something extraordinary was happening behind them. But as this catastrophe unfolded, Lot's wife made a choice that would seal her fate forever. Despite the angel's explicit warning, despite the danger behind them, despite the salvation ahead, she turned around. She looked back at the flaming destruction of everything she had known and loved. And in that moment, she was transformed into a pillar of salt. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. One moment she was a living, breathing woman, fleeing for her life. The next she was a monument of salt, frozen in time, forever gazing back at the destroyed city. But here's what's truly remarkable. That pillar of salt didn't just exist in the biblical narrative. It was a real physical landmark that people could visit and see with their own eyes. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote, "But Lot's wife continually turning back to view the city as she went from it, although God had forbidden her so to do, was changed into a pillar of salt, for I have seen it, and it remains at this day." This wasn't ancient mythology to Josephus. It was recent history. He claimed to have personally witnessed the pillar that had once been Lot's wife. Other ancient writers confirmed this account. Irenaeus, a church father from the 2nd century, also recorded that he had seen the pillar of salt. Clement of Rome, writing around the same time as Josephus, made similar claims. These testimonies span several centuries and come from different religious and cultural backgrounds, yet they all describe the same remarkable landmark. Today, near the Dead Sea at Mount Sodom in Israel, there stands an extraordinary pillar of salt that is 65 feet high and, when approached from the north, bears a striking resemblance to a human form. Local tradition has identified this formation as the remains of Lot's wife for thousands of years. But here's where science enters the story in a way that might shock you. Geological analysis has revealed that this pillar wasn't formed by normal erosion processes. Around 4,000 years ago, a catastrophic earthquake caused the roof of a salt cave to collapse, leaving behind this isolated pillar. The timing of this geological event aligns remarkably with the biblical chronology of Abraham and Lot's story. The earthquake that created this pillar may have been the same seismic event that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. But there's more to this story than just geological coincidence. The Hebrew verb used to describe Lot's wife's looking back carries deep psychological and spiritual implications. When someone looks back with such intensity that they become frozen in place, it suggests more than curiosity. It suggests a heart that was never fully committed to leaving, a soul that remained tied to what was being destroyed. This brings us to one of the most profound questions about Lot's wife. What was she really looking for when she turned around? Was she checking on her daughters, as some commentators suggest? Was she mourning the loss of her father's house? Or was she hoping against hope that somehow, someway, the city she loved might survive the divine judgment? The answer to this question reveals something deeper about human nature itself. We all have moments when we're torn between moving forward and clinging to the past. We all face times when we must choose between the familiar comfort of what we know and the uncertain promise of what lies ahead. Lot's wife's story isn't just about one woman's tragic choice. It's about the universal human struggle between attachment and freedom. But here's what makes her story even more complex: the silence that surrounds it. Why doesn't the Bible tell us her name? Why don't we know more about her background, her thoughts, her motivations? This silence has allowed generations of interpreters to fill in the gaps, creating a rich tapestry of tradition and speculation that sometimes tells us more about the interpreters than about the woman herself. Some feminist scholars have suggested that the anonymous nature of Lot's wife reflects the patriarchal values of ancient society, where women were often defined by their relationships to men rather than as individuals in their own right. Others have argued that her namelessness makes her a universal figure, representing all of us who struggle with the difficulty of leaving behind what we've known. The great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova wrote a powerful poem about Lot's wife that imagines her final moments not as rebellion against God, but as a deeply human response to unbearable loss. In Akhmatova's interpretation, Lot's wife turned back not in disobedience, but in love, a love so strong for her homeland that she was willing to sacrifice her life for one last glimpse of everything she was losing. This compassionate reading of the story opens up new possibilities for understanding what really happened that night. Perhaps Lot's wife wasn't the villain of the story, but its most tragic figure. Perhaps her transformation wasn't punishment for disobedience, but the natural consequence of a heart that could not let go of what was being destroyed. As we continue our investigation into the untold fate of Lot's wife, we'll explore these deeper questions and uncover even more shocking revelations about what ancient sources really tell us about her story. We'll examine the psychological and spiritual dimensions of her choice, investigate the geological evidence that connects her story to actual historical events, and discover how her tale has been interpreted and reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. But for now, consider this: if you were in Lot's wife's position, facing the complete destruction of everything you had known and loved, would you have been able to keep walking forward without looking back? The answer to that question might reveal more about the human condition than any theological treatise ever could. The question of what really happened to Lot's wife becomes even more intriguing when we examine the cultural and religious context of the ancient Near East. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah weren't just random settlements that happened to fall under divine judgment. They were part of a sophisticated urban civilization that had developed complex social, economic, and religious systems over centuries. Archaeological excavations in the region have revealed that these cities were centers of trade and commerce, with evidence of advanced metallurgy, pottery, and agricultural techniques. The people who lived there weren't primitive nomads. They were part of an established civilization with its own customs, traditions, and ways of life. For someone like Lot's wife, who had spent years, possibly decades, building a life in this environment, the command to leave everything behind and never look back would have been devastating. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. The ancient Jewish text known as the Book of Jubilees, which isn't part of the canonical Bible but preserves very old traditions, provides additional details about the destruction of Sodom and the fate of Lot's wife. According to this source, she didn't just look back once. She repeatedly turned around as they fled, unable to tear herself away from the sight of her burning city. The Book of Jubilees also suggests that her transformation wasn't instantaneous. Instead, it describes a gradual process where she became increasingly rigid and salt-like, as she continued to gaze back at the destruction. This account paints a picture of someone who was literally being consumed by her inability to let go, her body reflecting the spiritual paralysis that had taken hold of her soul. This gradual transformation theory is supported by some geological evidence as well. Salt formations don't typically occur instantly, even under extreme conditions. The process of crystallization usually takes time, and the specific type of salt formation found at Mount Sodom suggests a more complex geological process than a simple flash transformation. But there's another aspect of this story that's often overlooked: the role of memory and trauma in shaping our understanding of what happened. When we read about Lot's wife in the Bible, we're not just reading a historical account. We're reading a story that has been passed down through generations of oral tradition before being written down. Each retelling may have added new layers of meaning, new interpretations, new details that reflected the concerns and values of the people telling the story. The trauma of witnessing such massive destruction would have left an indelible mark on anyone who survived. Lot and his daughters would have carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. The image of a woman transformed into salt would have become a powerful symbol, a way of processing and making sense of an event that defied normal understanding. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the story: the question of whether Lot's wife was truly guilty of disobedience, or whether she was simply a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The traditional interpretation has always focused on her disobedience to the angel's command, but modern psychological understanding suggests that her behavior might have been a natural trauma response rather than willful rebellion. When people experience sudden catastrophic loss, their minds often struggle to process the reality of what's happening. Looking back, trying to make sense of the destruction, attempting to hold on to something from the past, these are all common responses to overwhelming trauma. From this perspective, Lot's wife's backward glance wasn't an act of defiance. It was a deeply human response to unbearable loss. The implications of this interpretation are profound. If Lot's wife was suffering from what we might now recognize as acute stress response or survivor's guilt, then her story becomes less about divine punishment and more about the devastating psychological impact of witnessing mass destruction. Her transformation into salt could be understood not as supernatural punishment, but as a metaphor for the way trauma can freeze us in place, preventing us from moving forward with our lives. This psychological reading of the story gains additional support when we consider the broader narrative context. Lot's family had just witnessed the attempted sexual assault of heavenly messengers. They had been forced to flee their home in the middle of the night, and they were watching their entire world burn behind them. The psychological strain of these events would have been enormous, particularly for someone who had deep emotional ties to the city and its people. The ancient world understood trauma differently than we do today, but that doesn't mean they were unaware of its effects. The Hebrew concept of nephesh, often translated as soul, encompasses not just spiritual reality, but psychological and emotional well-being. When the Bible describes Lot's wife's transformation, it may be using the language and imagery available to ancient writers to describe what we would now recognize as psychological breakdown. But there's yet another layer to this mystery that most people have never considered: the possibility that Lot's wife's story is connected to actual historical events that have been documented in other ancient sources. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia describe catastrophic events in the region around the time period when Abraham and Lot would have lived. These texts speak of cities being destroyed by fire from heaven, of the earth opening up and swallowing entire settlements, of survivors fleeing across the desert carrying tales of divine judgment. One particularly intriguing tablet describes a woman who was found crystallized in salt after a great earthquake struck a city in the south. The tablet is fragmentary and difficult to date precisely, but it comes from roughly the same time period and geographical region as the biblical account. Could this be an independent record of the same event that inspired the story of Lot's wife? The question becomes even more complex when we consider the role of salt in ancient Near Eastern culture and religion. Salt wasn't just a preservative or seasoning, it was a substance with deep symbolic meaning. In many ancient cultures, salt was associated with permanence, preservation, and covenant relationships. When someone was transformed into salt, they were being preserved for eternity, becoming a permanent monument to whatever they represented. This symbolic understanding of salt adds another dimension to Lot's wife's story. Her transformation might not have been intended as punishment, but as preservation. Perhaps she was turned into salt not to condemn her, but to ensure that her story would never be forgotten, that future generations would always remember the importance of moving forward rather than clinging to the past. The location of her transformation is also significant. She became a pillar of salt, not in Sodom itself, but somewhere between the city and the mountains where her family was supposed to find safety. This placement suggests that she was caught between two worlds, unable to fully embrace either the destruction behind her or the salvation ahead of her. Her physical location at the moment of transformation mirrors her emotional and spiritual state, suspended between past and future, between attachment and freedom. This geographical detail has led some scholars to suggest that Lot's wife's story is actually an etiology, a story created to explain a natural landmark. Ancient peoples often created narratives to explain unusual geological formations, and the salt pillars near the Dead Sea would certainly have demanded explanation. The story of Lot's wife might have developed as a way to make sense of these striking formations while also conveying important moral and spiritual lessons. However, this etiological interpretation doesn't necessarily negate the historical reality of the events described. It's possible that both things are true, that there was a real woman who was transformed into salt during the destruction of Sodom, and that her story was later used to explain the salt formations that visitors could see and touch. The physical evidence and the spiritual meaning could coexist, each reinforcing the other. The mystery deepens when we consider how the story of Lot's wife has been interpreted across different cultures and time periods. In Islamic tradition, she is known as Wayla, and her story is told with slightly different details that emphasize her active participation in the corruption of Sodom. In Gnostic texts, she appears as a figure of wisdom who chose to witness the destruction rather than flee from it, making her transformation a conscious choice rather than a punishment. These varied interpretations suggest that the story of Lot's wife touches on universal human experiences that transcend specific religious or cultural boundaries. Whether she's seen as a cautionary tale about disobedience, a tragic figure overwhelmed by loss, or a wise woman who chose to bear witness to divine judgment, her story continues to resonate with people who face their own struggles between past and future, between attachment and freedom. As we delve deeper into the mystery of what really happened to Lot's wife, we begin to see that her story is far more complex and nuanced than the simple Sunday school version most of us learned. She emerges not as a one-dimensional character who made a single bad choice, but as a fully human figure caught in circumstances that would have challenged anyone's faith, courage, and emotional resilience. The silence that surrounds her story in the biblical text isn't emptiness. It's space for us to enter into her experience and grapple with the same questions she faced. In a world where we're constantly being asked to leave behind familiar ways of thinking and living, where we're challenged to move forward into uncertain futures, her story speaks to our deepest fears and highest aspirations. The question of what really happened to Lot's wife becomes even more compelling when we examine the timeline of events that night. Most people assume her transformation occurred immediately after she looked back, but ancient sources suggest a more complex sequence of events that challenges our understanding of the entire story. According to some rabbinical traditions, the destruction of Sodom didn't happen all at once. Instead, it unfolded over several hours, giving the fleeing family multiple opportunities to witness the catastrophe. During this extended period, Lot's wife didn't just look back once, she repeatedly turned around. each glance drawing her deeper into a state of spiritual and physical paralysis. The Talmud describes her transformation as a gradual process that began with her feet. As she continued to gaze back at the burning city, crystallization started at the ground and slowly worked its way up her body. This detail is fascinating because it suggests that she had multiple opportunities to stop looking, to turn away and continue her escape, but something kept drawing her back to the site of destruction. This gradual transformation theory gains credibility when we consider the geological processes that create salt formations. The type of salt pillar found at Mount Sodom requires specific conditions and time to form properly. A sudden flash transformation would likely result in a different type of formation than what we actually observe in the archaeological record. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that most people have never heard. Ancient Jewish texts suggest that Lot's wife wasn't the only member of the family who struggled with leaving Sodom behind. According to the book of Jasher, an ancient Hebrew text that's referenced in the Bible itself, Lot's daughters also looked back during their escape, but they were protected by the angels who physically turned their heads forward and shielded their eyes. This detail raises profound questions about divine justice and mercy. If Lot's daughters were protected from the consequences of looking back, why wasn't his wife given the same protection? Some scholars suggest that the difference lay not in the physical act of looking, but in the heart attitude behind it. The daughters looked back in fear and confusion, but Lot's wife looked back in longing and regret. The distinction becomes even more significant when we examine the Hebrew word used to describe her emotional state. The text uses a term that implies deep attachment and unwillingness to separate. This wasn't casual curiosity or even understandable concern for what was being left behind. This was a profound emotional and spiritual connection that made leaving impossible. Archaeological evidence from the region provides additional context that most people have never considered. Excavations near the Dead Sea have revealed that the cities of the plain were destroyed not just by fire, but by a combination of seismic activity, volcanic action, and what appears to be a meteor impact. The geological record shows evidence of extreme heat, crushed buildings, and widespread salt deposits that occurred simultaneously across multiple sites. This multifaceted destruction would have created a spectacle unlike anything in human experience. The sky would have been filled with fire, the ground would have been shaking violently, and the air would have been thick with ash and sulfur. For someone witnessing this from a distance, the sight would have been both terrifying and mesmerizing, creating a psychological pull that would have been almost impossible to resist. The psychological impact of witnessing such destruction cannot be overstated. Modern studies of disaster survivors show that people often experience a phenomenon called disaster fascination, where they become unable to look away from catastrophic events even when their own safety is at risk. This involuntary response occurs because the human brain struggles to process destruction on such a massive scale. From this perspective, Lot's wife's backward glance wasn't an act of rebellion against divine command, but a natural human response to witnessing something beyond her ability to comprehend. Her transformation into salt might represent not punishment for disobedience, but the psychological paralysis that can occur when someone is overwhelmed by traumatic events. This interpretation gains additional support from the broader narrative context. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just a local event, it was a cosmic judgment that affected the entire region. The Bible describes Abraham seeing the smoke rising from the cities from many miles away, suggesting that the destruction was visible across vast distances. For someone as close as Lot's wife, the sensory overload would have been overwhelming. But there's another aspect of this story that's often overlooked: the role of supernatural forces in the events of that night. The Bible makes it clear that angels were present, not just as messengers, but as active participants in the destruction. These weren't ordinary men who happened to visit Lot's house. They were divine beings with the power to strike an entire city blind and call down fire from heaven. The presence of these supernatural entities adds another layer of complexity to Lot's wife's story. If angels were actively involved in the destruction, then her transformation might not have been a natural consequence of looking back, but a supernatural intervention designed to serve a specific purpose. Perhaps she was transformed not as punishment, but as a witness, a permanent testimony to what had occurred. This interpretation aligns with the ancient understanding of salt as a preservative. Just as salt prevents decay and preserves food for future consumption, Lot's wife's transformation into salt might have been intended to preserve her testimony for future generations. Her pillar of salt became a landmark that people could visit and touch, a tangible reminder of divine judgment and the importance of obedience. The location of her transformation supports this interpretation. She became a pillar of salt not in some hidden place, but along what would become a major travel route. For centuries, travelers passing through the region would have seen her pillar and heard her story, making her transformation ongoing testimony to the reality of divine judgment. Ancient historians confirm that the pillar of salt was indeed a well-known landmark for centuries after the event. Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, claimed to have seen it personally. Other writers from different time periods and cultural backgrounds made similar claims, suggesting that the formation was stable and recognizable for an extended period. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Recent archaeological surveys of the region have identified not just one, but multiple salt formations that could potentially be identified with Lot's wife. Some are on the Israeli side of the Dead Sea, others are in Jordan, and still others have been identified in areas that are now underwater due to changes in the sea level over the millennia. This multiplicity of potential sites raises intriguing questions about the nature of the event itself. Was there one specific pillar that was Lot's wife, or did the catastrophic events of that night create multiple salt formations that ancient peoples interpreted as connected to her story? The geological evidence suggests that the destruction was so widespread and intense that it could have created numerous unusual formations simultaneously. The implications of this discovery are profound. If multiple salt pillars were created during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, then Lot's wife's story might be representative of a larger pattern of transformation that affected multiple people in the region. She might not have been the only one who looked back and was transformed, but simply the most famous or significant example. This possibility is supported by fragments of ancient texts that mention other people who were transformed into salt during the same event. While these accounts are less detailed and preserved than the biblical narrative, they suggest that Lot's wife's fate might not have been unique. The transformation of people into salt might have been a widespread phenomenon associated with the destruction of the cities. The question of whether these transformations were literal or metaphorical remains one of the most debated aspects of the story. Some scholars argue that the accounts should be understood as symbolic descriptions of spiritual states rather than physical transformations. Others maintain that the consistent testimony of ancient witnesses supports a literal interpretation. The debate becomes even more complex when we consider the role of collective memory in shaping the story. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would have been a traumatic event for everyone in the region, not just Lot's family. The psychological impact of witnessing such destruction would have affected entire communities, creating shared memories that might have been processed and preserved through storytelling. In this context, Lot's wife's story might represent not just one woman's experience, but a collective memory of how the destruction affected everyone who witnessed it. Her transformation into salt might symbolize the way trauma can freeze people in place, preventing them from moving forward with their lives and keeping them permanently connected to the moment of loss. This collective interpretation helps explain why the story has resonated so powerfully across cultures and time periods. Everyone who has experienced significant loss or trauma can relate to the feeling of being frozen in place, unable to move forward because of overwhelming attachment to what has been lost. Lot's wife's pillar of salt becomes a universal symbol of this human experience. The story also raises profound questions about the nature of choice and free will in the face of divine command. Was Lot's wife truly free to choose whether or not to look back, or was her response predetermined by her character and circumstances? The biblical narrative suggests that she had a choice, but the psychological and cultural factors we've examined suggest that her response might have been more complex than simple obedience or disobedience. The question becomes even more intriguing when we consider the role of love in her decision. According to some interpretations, she looked back not out of rebellion or curiosity, but out of love, either for the city itself or for people who remained behind. If this is true, then her transformation represents not the punishment of disobedience, but the tragic consequence of love that couldn't let go. This interpretation transforms Lot's wife from a cautionary tale about the dangers of disobedience into a profound meditation on the nature of love and loss. Her story becomes a reminder that even the most beautiful human emotions can become destructive when they prevent us from moving forward into the future that God has planned for us. As we continue to unravel the mystery of what really happened to Lot's wife, we begin to see that her story is far more complex and nuanced than most people realize. She emerges not as a simple example of divine punishment, but as a fully human figure whose experience speaks to some of the deepest questions about faith, love, loss, and the difficulty of moving forward when everything familiar is being left behind. The silence that surrounds her story in the biblical text isn't emptiness. It's an invitation for us to enter into her experience and wrestle with the same questions she faced. In a world where we're constantly being challenged to leave behind familiar ways of thinking and living, where we're asked to move forward into uncertain futures, her story speaks to our deepest fears and our highest aspirations. The enduring power of Lot's wife's story lies not just in its mystery, but in its profound relevance to the human condition. Her transformation into salt serves as a mirror reflecting our own struggles with change, loss, and the difficulty of embracing an uncertain future when the past holds such powerful attractions. What makes her story even more compelling is how it has been interpreted across different cultures and time periods. The great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova wrote movingly about Lot's wife, reimagining her final moments not as rebellion against God, but as a deeply human response to unbearable loss. In Akhmatova's vision, Lot's wife turned back not in disobedience, but in love. A love so profound for her homeland that she was willing to sacrifice everything for one last glimpse of what she was losing forever. This compassionate interpretation opens up entirely new possibilities for understanding what really happened that night. Perhaps she wasn't the villain of this ancient drama, but its most tragic figure. Perhaps her transformation wasn't divine punishment for breaking a rule, but the natural consequence of a heart that simply could not release its grip on everything that gave life meaning. The feminist reinterpretation of her story has added another layer of complexity that challenges traditional readings. Modern scholars point out that she is never given a name in the biblical text, referred to only as Lot's wife, defined entirely by her relationship to her husband. This anonymity might reflect the patriarchal values of ancient society, where women were often seen as extensions of their male relatives rather than individuals with their own agency and identity. Yet this namelessness also makes her universal. She becomes every woman who has ever faced the impossible choice between security and freedom, between the known and the unknown, between the comfortable familiarity of home and the terrifying promise of transformation. Her story transcends the boundaries of any single culture or time period because it speaks to experiences that are fundamentally human. The psychological dimensions of her choice become even more significant when we consider what we now know about trauma and loss. Modern research has shown that when people experience sudden catastrophic change, their minds often struggle to process the reality of what's happening. Looking back, trying to make sense of destruction, attempting to hold on to something from the past. These are all natural responses to overwhelming loss. From this perspective, Lot's wife's backward glance wasn't an act of defiance against divine authority. but a deeply human response to unbearable trauma. Her transformation into salt could be understood not as supernatural punishment, but as a powerful metaphor for the way overwhelming loss can freeze us in place, preventing us from moving forward with our lives and keeping us permanently connected to the moment of devastation. The geological evidence we've examined adds another fascinating dimension to this interpretation. The salt pillar that has been identified with Lot's wife for thousands of years was created by a catastrophic earthquake that occurred around the same time as the biblical narrative. This convergence of geological fact and ancient story suggests that the account might be based on actual events that ancient peoples witnessed and tried to understand through their available framework of meaning. The earthquake that created the salt pillar was one of the most powerful in the recorded history of the Dead Sea region, with the force to reshape the landscape permanently. For people living in that time and place, such an event would have seemed like nothing less than divine intervention. The transformation of a person into salt during such a catastrophe would have been interpreted as a sign of cosmic significance, a message from the divine realm about the consequences of human choices. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It doesn't end with destruction. The pillar of salt that Lot's wife became served as a landmark for centuries, a permanent reminder visible to all who passed through the region. Ancient historians like Josephus claim to have seen it personally, and travelers from different cultures and time periods left records of their encounters with this mysterious formation. This permanence suggests that her transformation might have served a purpose beyond punishment. In becoming a pillar of salt, she became a witness, a permanent testimony to the reality of divine judgment and the importance of the choices we make when faced with moments of crisis. Her story became a teaching tool, a way for generations to grapple with questions about obedience, love, loss, and the difficulty of moving forward when everything familiar is being left behind. The universality of her story is demonstrated by how it appears in different forms across cultures. The motif of looking back and facing consequences appears in Greek mythology with Orpheus and Eurydice, in various folk tales from around the world, and in literature from every age. This suggests that the story taps into something fundamental about human nature, something that transcends specific religious or cultural contexts. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Lot's wife's story is how it continues to speak to contemporary audiences. In our modern world, we all face moments when we must choose between clinging to familiar ways of life and embracing uncertain change. We all experience the pull of nostalgia, the temptation to look back at what we're leaving behind rather than focusing on what lies ahead. Her story reminds us that transformation is never easy, that moving forward requires not just physical action, but emotional and spiritual commitment. It challenges us to examine our own attachments, to consider what we might be holding on to that prevents us from fully embracing the future God has planned for us. The mystery of what really happened to Lot's wife may never be fully solved. The biblical text is too brief, the archaeological evidence too complex, and the passage of time too great for us to know with certainty every detail of that night in Sodom. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the power of her story lies not in its historical specificity, but in its ongoing relevance to the human experience. In the end, Lot's wife's story is our story. It's the story of everyone who has ever faced the difficulty of letting go, of moving forward when the past seems more appealing than the future, of choosing faith over fear when the stakes are highest. Her transformation into salt serves as both warning and promise, reminding us that while looking back can freeze us in place, looking forward with faith can lead to transformation and new life. The pillar of salt that bears her name still stands today, a testament to the enduring power of this ancient story. Whether we understand her fate as literal transformation or powerful metaphor, her story continues to challenge and inspire us. She reminds us that in the moments when we must choose between past and future, between attachment and freedom, between fear and faith, the direction we look can determine not just our physical destination, but our spiritual destiny. So the next time you find yourself facing a moment of necessary change, remember Lot's wife. Remember the power of looking forward rather than back. Remember that transformation, though difficult, is possible. And remember that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in the answers we discover, but in the questions we're willing to ask and the courage we find to keep moving forward, even when we can't see what lies ahead. The untold fate of Lot's wife isn't just about what happened to one woman thousands of years ago. It's about what happens to all of us when we're faced with the choice between past and future, between safety and transformation, between the familiar and the divine. Her story continues to unfold in every life that faces that choice, and in every heart that must decide which direction to look when everything depends on that single moment of decision.